formally. And then I would just like to add a little bit of housekeeping. So we're going to try and keep this to an hour. I know there's a lot to say, but if you could post any questions that you might have in the chat group, we'll try and get some of them answered during the webinar, because what we'll do is Judy's going to open, and then Andrew Davies will speak for about 10 minutes, Professor Zinn for another 10 minutes, and then we'll open it into Q&A. And if we don't manage to get to any of your questions, we will put our contact details, Sandra's and mine, in the chat group, and you're welcome to send them through to us, and we'll refer them on to today's experts. So without any ado, I'd like to hand over to Judy. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Sandra. So good afternoon, everybody. It is indeed a fine, fresh winter's day here in Johannesburg. It's what I call it Lazy Lizard Day, because ideally one should be lying near a window on a daybed, stretched out like a lizard, and reading one of your favorite authors. However, here we are sitting in front of a screen as we enter day 90 plus days of a very severe lockdown in South Africa. Now, I have been in and out of a state of what I call delusion one moment and illusion, fantasizing around what reality really is and what reality means. So I'm going to leave that thought with you around how does one reconstruct reality. Now, some of you may in fact be back at the office. And so what has changed? What has changed for you in terms of the nature of your work, the workplace, and the workforce? And when you are truly present, really present, what does it feel like? How do you feel? And how do you own those feelings that sit with you? So who are the hosts today? Your host today is Business for South Africa. And we came into action at a NEDLAC meeting when the country embarked on announcing on that evening, when the president announced that we will be in level 5 lockdown, and explained to the nation what that meant and what a risk-adjusted strategy is all about. So as organized business, we are actively collaborating with government to use business resources and capacity to support public sector initiatives. We have mobilized volunteer resources from across South African business bodies and organizations. And the fact that you're here today, you count as one of those people who are part of this initiative, where we as government and the private sector, it doesn't matter how big or how small, as we work to drive a coordinated, proactive program as we head towards the Great Reset. Not the Great Recession, not the Great Depression, not the Great Shock, not the Great White, the Great Reset. As we try and ward off the inevitability of a recession that leads into depression. The two lead structures of Business for South Africa is Business Unity South Africa and the Black Business Council. And I'm the Secretary General of the Black Business Council, and this is how I lead one of the work streams at Business for South Africa. But when I'm not participating in Business for South Africa, I am the Chief Executive Officer of South Africa's largest integrated tourism company. And if there is a sector that overnight came to a standstill when the aircraft stopped landing on our runways, that is the sector I play in, a sector that is bleeding, a sector that every day faces Armageddon. So today's business webinar builds on the theme of mental health. Our first one, very briefly, because some of you may not have been present, dealt with the mental health issues that our employees confront and what we can do to support them. And in that respect, with the assistance of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, we developed a set of guidelines which are available. And if you would like a copy of those guidelines, please pop your details in the chat group. Or you can go to our website, which is also on the chat group. Danny or Sandra or Jan Keller will populate those details for you. So today, we deal with another aspect of mental health. We deal with the return to work and what that means for us. Business for South Africa has been advocating for an accelerated rephasing and reopening of the economy. And what does that mean? Because now more than ever, as our economy opens up, we become even more acutely aware of the global shifts and the fact that our interconnectedness has disrupted one of the most critical supply chains, and that is the access to medicines. And our audience today is leadership in business, employees in business, and of course, a very warm welcome to the media, because you too are often forgotten as a key frontline worker. And every day you're out there getting the story, bringing the stories to South Africa so that we can understand what's going on in our own communities and how we are interconnecting to the rest of the world. So our excellent panelists today will talk about the psychology of work. Are we returning to the way we worked before? What changes have been made at work? Have they been encapsulated? Sorry for the big word, I can't think of an easier word. How has it made its way into policy? The psychology in the workforce, when you look at capacity, capability, business has to continue with half the size of the workforce, maybe a third, a quarter. What does that mean? And the psychology of the workplace. What did we learn when some of us were fortunate enough to work remotely? What did we learn when the lines between work and life became blurred? When the home and family became the workplace and often participated as part of the workforce? When normally some of us use clocking in and clocking out machines, or we swipe our cards every day, that was replaced by the mute button or turn off the video button as we entered the world of remote virtual webinars. So the webinar today is going to deal with what do we do now that we go back to work? Because surely it cannot be business as usual. It's no longer viable. And it's not just about putting in place the practical requirements of social distancing, which I hate. I prefer to call it physical distancing, the hygiene requirements. And then, of course, what we want to talk to today by our excellent panelists will share with you their insights, their expertise, and their learnings around the psychological impact of COVID-19 in the workplace. Now, some employees are fearful of returning to work, not only because they may become infected on their way to work, in the boardrooms, going to the bathroom, but also because of stigma and confusion in respect of the new workplace policies and intra-workplace relations. So a couple of questions that I'm throwing out there that our panelists will deal with. Can my employer fire me if I don't return to the office? What if I have kids at home because of school and daycare closures? What if I'm at higher risk of contracting COVID-19 and I may not be over 60? I could be 40 plus. Can my boss cut my hours or pay due to coronavirus concerns? Will I be brave enough to articulate my concerns for fear of committing career suicide? No protocols in place. We've not been asked to participate in the design of the protocols. My colleagues do not seem to take COVID-19 seriously. They don't wear masks. There's no directional movement in the workplace. So thank you for joining us today as we seek to discuss these challenges, and our excellent panelists will address them. The session will also touch on international learnings of how we reimagine the workplace, because some countries, of course, a month or two ahead of us. And so get ready, get set as we begin to embark on the great reset for South Africa as we reopen the economy. And we are joined by, firstly, I'll introduce Andrew, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Shirley Zinn, Mr. Andrew Davis, a clinical psychologist, and the managing director of ICAS, to whom many of us belong, or we outsource our services to ICAS. So our two speakers are world leaders. They are considered to be best in class, but over and above their professional expertise, they are passionate and committed to purposeful life and purposeful meaning in business and in community. And so they've agreed to share with us today their expertise. And Andrew and Shirley, if I'm allowed to suspend all ceremony, if I may just call you by your first names, I'm going to have Andrew lead first, and then Professor Shirley Zinn, or Shirley, will then come in and share her inputs, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. The screen is now yours, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Judy. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to address the audience. I think there's been a lot of discussion over the past 3 months of the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on mental health. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. What I want to do is to focus on work-specific issues and challenges that we've seen emerging during this period. The organization I work for provides employee assistance services to about 4.5 million people across 185 countries. In South Africa, about 800,000 lives across 600 organizations. That's psychosocial support, medical advisory, and some executive coaching. And so I've had a look at the numbers over the last 3 months. We've seen about 28,000 people who sought assistance between the 27th of March and the 27th of June. And there's some interesting trends that have emerged from that. The initial hard lockdown period, during that period, we saw a decline in cases relative to the same period the prior year. People were sort of settling into the stay-at-home arrangement. There were very few COVID-19 cases at the time. The situation was quite novel for many, and the stress levels, I think, were relatively low. But as the lockdown progressed, we started to see an increase in people seeking assistance for a range of issues. The total number of cases returned to your pre-COVID levels. There's been some changes also in the reasons that people were seeking assistance. Firstly, there was a 26-fold increase in the number of people seeking medical advice from our medical advisory team. About 8,200 individuals sought that kind of assistance. Much of it was COVID-19 related, so questions around how you contract the disease, fear about someone who's tested positive, what the symptoms are, how what sort of hygiene measures need to be put in place, how you get tested, when you get tested, where you get tested, how to quarantine oneself, work-specific protocols, so a lot of that, but quite quickly. And interestingly, the pattern then shifted as the lockdown progressed with COVID-19 related queries starting to be the focus. So not directly related to the virus, but indirectly related largely to life under lockdown. We saw homeschooling issues, for example, a 40% increase in education related queries. We've also seen an increase in individuals presenting with various forms of financial distress. Judy would certainly understand that from what she mentioned with her organization. For example, there's been a 100% increase in requests for debt counseling, a similar increase in those requesting budgeting assistance. Also interesting, a 300% increase in requests for estate planning and wills, probably reflecting a growing concern about the future, people wanting to get their affairs in order. And then regarding mental health specifically, there's been an increase in people seeking help for mental health and psychiatric disorders such as anxiety disorders, predominantly adjustment disorders, depression, addiction disorders. So pornography addiction has gone up by about 28%. Interestingly, also the severity of cases has increased substantially. About 15% of our cases are presenting with a severe impact. Those are people who are suicidal, for example, and certainly completely dysfunctional in their home and work environment, requiring a lot more intensive intervention. When it comes to anxiety, we see the increase in anxiety, which parallels much of what we see in the rest of the world. A lot of that really doesn't have to do specifically with fear of the virus, although there are cases where the anxiety relates to that. Most of it relates to the uncertainty. And I was just looking at the comments as we were waiting, and people were talking about uncertainty. We know the greatest fear is fear of the unknown. So certainly a lot of it was about the impact that the virus is having on work, on people's livelihoods, on the future, on their children, etc. There's been a relative increase in people seeking support for interpersonal conflict as they exist in this new kind of normal, the prolonged lockdown situation. So interpersonal conflict with significant others. We've seen a small increase in the number of people seeking help for domestic violence related issues, which we thought we may see more of, certainly as has been reported in the media. There has been an increase, but perhaps not in line with what we've seen. Not surprisingly, a big increase in people seeking help for mental health issues by digital or virtual means. So our video counseling facility, our online chat, all of those alternative means of being able to access much needed help have been well used and well accepted during the period. The impact of working from home during lockdown, I think, has been interesting, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. Firstly, it's important to note that the impact of the regulations on organizations is going to differ significantly depending on the nature of the industry. So somebody working in a high-tech environment, such as a Microsoft, for example, is going to have a different experience to someone who works in manufacturing or in mining or in the entertainment industry, for example. For some people, being put into lockdown is about not being able to work, having to deal with the uncertainty and fear of whether they are going to get a salary, whether they'll have a job at the end of it all. Whereas for other people, it's about simply adjusting the work that I ordinarily do as an accountant or a lawyer, but in the home environment. So certainly there's some differences there. As the head of Ford once said, you can't build Fords at home. So needing to adjust to the lockdown was certainly something that's quite significant. And we do a lot of work, coaching work with managers and leaders. And over the period, we've noticed some interesting trends which are worth commenting on. The first thing is that at the start of the lockdown, people were pretty unanimous in support of government's initiative. They were very compliant, both personally, so if they kids wanted to go down the road to visit their cousins, they would police them. They were very compliant professionally, making sure that people went home. There was lockdown, there were appropriate protocols in place. But this started to change with time. And particularly with the first extension of the lockdown, managers and leaders started to display a much greater variance of views on whether this is a serious virus or not. The whole debate about lives versus livelihoods, whether people would die from the virus or die from financial ruin, the whole issue of infringements of personal rights and freedom started to creep in. So we saw these contrasting views starting to emerge with time, and an increasingly large number of formerly compliant people started to break the rules to varying degrees, minor transgressions. Yes, of course, you can go and visit your cousins, or no one's going to tell me if I can exercise or not. I'm going to kind of get out there. And so there are a number of factors psychologically that influenced people's decisions. A fascinating concept that we saw in psychology, and it was interesting because this was reflected by our colleagues in Europe, who had been working on the pandemic and are a month or two ahead of South Africa, and that's the concept of the tipping point, which seems to exist the world over at around 4 to 5 weeks in a lockdown situation. Prior to that period, most people are compliant. The virus is the most important thing, and people comply to the legislation and health regulations. But at around 4 to 5 weeks, which was in our extended hard lockdown, it almost reached a point where other things became more important than the virus. And that's just quite an interesting concept because it goes to people's values, their beliefs, their experience. And in South Africa, it was interesting because at that time we had relatively few cases, we had very few deaths, yet we started to feel the impact of the shutdown on people's livelihoods. And so there was a big shift that we saw amongst people in the workplace in relation to that. Working from home is supposed to be something that is a positive benefit, a sought after benefit. So a lot of people have said, well, why is that so stressful? Everyone's wanted to work from home. Well, I think the defining feature here is in most instances, people who choose to work from home have jobs that are conducive to it and home circumstances that are conducive to it. In this situation, we had a forced choice, and people were not only forced to work from home, they were also forced to stay at home. So a lot of the benefits certainly weren't there, and people's rights and freedoms felt significantly restricted as well as a result of that. It wasn't only the comfort of working from home, there were a lot of other factors that existed there. And what we also don't understand is different people have different circumstances. They might be in a difficult interpersonal relationship. They might be in cramped home circumstances that are not conducive to working from home. They might not have the right kind of technology or tools to do their jobs. I was talking to someone at one of the financial institutions who's responsible for training, and he said it was just expected that he was able to do his job and continue to do his job as he had previously, but he found it incredibly difficult to run a 3-day intensive training using the kind of digital platforms. It's all very well to get people to concentrate for an hour or two, but if you think Zoom fatigue is bad, trying to run a 2 or 3 day training. So there's a huge amount of frustration as a result of that. There also are those that either were socially isolated, on their own and found it very difficult, particularly people who were extroverted, and a lot of people that really enjoy the buzz of the office, the engagement with other people, the social interaction. They found networking particularly difficult. They miss out on the coffee and cigarette breaks, the corridor discussions, the lunches, the subtleties and nuances of how decisions are very often made in the work environment. So that kind of casual banter and being part of a corporate culture. One of the leaders actually said to me, it's hard to maintain a unique corporate culture when all we're doing is kind of working in this remote world. Some people find it very difficult to structure themselves, to structure their own work. Those that have had to deal with kids at home, normally when kids go to school, their school environment is very structured. When you have to educate them at home, you have to create that structure, but the same applies to adults as well. So people don't realize that working from home requires particular skills and an environment that's conducive to that. And when that isn't, it sows the seeds for a lot of distress. And, work from home jobs can challenge your mental health as a result of it. It can turn normally optimistic, productive worker bees into tired, unmotivated, and irritable toads. So when you look at the psychology of returning to work, much of what I've spoken about thus far has relevance and meaning when it comes to that. So there's several considerations regarding the impact of returning to work. And the first one, which everyone's mentioned in their questions, is coping with uncertainty. We coped with a lot of uncertainty when with lockdown, we had to move away from work, personally, professionally, financially. And now returning to the office creates new uncertainties about personal safety, about job security, about how to adapt to new routines and ways of doing things. There's also these opposing views. And Judy touched on some of those. There are those that are coming back to work who are terrified about contracting the virus. They're very reluctant to return. They're anxious. They're hypervigilant. They're prickly. They're very policeman-like. There's the fear that this group will be very judgmental and knowingly or unknowingly stigmatize those who contract the virus or who've had the virus. They're very critical of the company not having the right protections and policies and of forcing them to come back to work, etc. And then in contrast to that, you have those who feel that their personal freedoms have been violated. They don't believe that they should be dictated to. They're not at all afraid of the virus. And this sort of clashes with their neoliberal views and beliefs on the world. And it puts people in conflict. So if you can imagine the one being Jane and the other John, that then go back to work and go into a meeting room, and Jane complains that John didn't sanitize properly. He's sitting far too close to her, not wearing his mask properly. So these are some of the tensions that exist that are fueled by people's different views, different ideologies that we have to deal with. The second consideration is that people are returning to a different work environment with new rules, new processes, even a new architecture. People refer to this new normal. Some of you might have seen on social media a lovely example when, it was only a few months ago where someone would come into the office with a cake. And one of the team members would then blow all over the cake and everyone else would eat it. In today's world, that suddenly seems really, really weird. We're now in a world where we're touching things, being with other people and breathing the same air is risky. People are returning to the office where they can't see facial expressions, they can't travel, they can't go to the company gym, their lunch hours are staggered, meeting numbers are restricted. There was a case in one of our international companies where the HR director was called. They thought there was a protest developing in the lobby because the people were just gathering more and more until they realized that security was only allowing 2 people at a time in the lift. This is a 40-story building, so people were taking hours to be able to get up there. So all of this is changing. And for those who know a little bit about architecture, interior design, space planners are having a field day in redesigning offices. About 20 years ago, we moved to an open plan office, and then we had partitioning, then it was taken away, then there was hot desking. All of that is now being reconceptualized. So the architecture, we spoke about the architecture of apartheid before. The architecture of Corona is now starting to change the workplace. And in all of this, leaders are under an enormous amount of pressure. With the economy under strain, the predictions are that about 1.6 million jobs will be lost as a result of this. People are returning to a workplace where there's this huge uncertainty. Will there be a place for me? Retrenchments are probably inevitable. And with that hanging over their heads, they're likely to be anxious anxious, to be stressed, to be paranoid, to hang on to what they've got, to not share and work as a team. And all of that makes people really prone to mental health challenges. And all these considerations have a profound effect on those who lead organizations. For the first time in our history, leaders have to formulate a return to work plan that prioritizes the physical and psychological safety of employees while still making sure that operational needs of the business are met. They need to quickly learn the lessons of lockdown. So many leaders have said to me there have been significant learnings about the way in which we work. They have to make these necessary changes to survive and compete. But they still have to reestablish their organizational culture and ensure that people are motivated to survive and compete. And so this people management component of their role is absolutely critical. It's a new skill set, the ability to demonstrate empathy on the one hand, and then to protect the welfare and well-being of employees on the other, and combining that with the acumen to adapt, to make tough commercial decisions and essentially repair the balance sheet is all really, really tough. And so balancing the social and the financial while maintaining that workforce is something that is really challenging. Perhaps just to end off with that, because I know Shirley will address more of it, is something that a doctor said to me, a medical doctor said to me a little while ago. She said at the end of it all, it'll be those who are able to create jobs and resuscitate the sick economy that will emerge as the true heroes of the pandemic, not only those who resuscitate the sick victims of COVID-19. She was saying, you know, she feels she goes home and people hoot at 7 o'clock in her neighborhood. They should actually be hooting for those people that can create jobs, because they have the uncertainty surrounding that, not only for the healthcare workers. So I think the mental health challenges that we're confronting at the moment are enormous. And we know from a psychological point of view that it's the kind of stress and uncertainty that creates the foundation for people to become ill when they don't have appropriate coping mechanisms. So having employee assistance programs in place, being able to assist individuals as much as possible to deal with these kind of challenges is critical to businesses and their success going forward. It's a very, very new normal. It's an uncertain and constantly changing new normal. And we need a significant amount of resilience to deal with that. And those that are struggling to cope need all the help and support that they can get. I hope I haven't rambled on for too long, Judy, but I'll leave it at that.
No, Andrew, everyone has been commenting in the side chat bar, so they haven't felt that you've gone on too long. They are finding your content extremely engaging and on point. So we have time constraints, not you. So our next speaker, I'm sorry everyone, I'm sitting in the sun, don't hold it against me. Our next speaker is Professor Shirley Zinn. So I just need to share with you that I know Shirley from childhood. So I'm declaring my conflict of interest here. But many of you know Shirley as the woman who turned around SARS, who turned around Nedbank in terms of redefining the role of human, what was it called before, human resources. And Shirley is one of our leaders in terms of human capital and the role of human capital being a business imperative. Of course, she's written her book, Swimming Upstream, and her presentation is going to focus on, in the main, and it will include other insights. She will make the case for why now more than ever, human capital needs to be the focus of every board meeting, every exco, every manco, every union meeting, shop stewards meeting. So over to you, Professor Shirley Zinn.
Thank you so much, Judy, for having me, and thanks to all the participants. And Andrew, also thanks for that very comprehensive presentation that you've just done. And so it's a very, very important discussion that we are having here today, and it's a long overdue discussion, Judy. So I'm very pleased that we are finally here. I think that our priority number one, and I just want to give this little bit of context and go back to something, Judy, that you said right at the beginning. When we start to ask people how they are feeling, when you ask people to do a regular check-in and start with, you know, where are you at? I think it makes people really have to think, kind of like take a step back. And I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to care more about how people are feeling. People have been in lockdown for more than 90 days. how are they feeling? There's fear, frustration, anxiety, uncertainty, stress. And how do we get our minds around re-engaging and re-engaging the world and just venturing out? How does it feel to have to do this with all this anxiety and fear? And I think when we look back at this experience many years from now, we need to ask ourselves the question, did we lead with humanity? Were we kind enough? Were we generous enough? Were we compassionate and empathetic enough? And we see that there are job cuts, there are salary cuts, and I can talk a lot about that. We see the poverty, we see the food parcels that are never enough. We have seen an explosion of gender violence and femicide. We are also, at the overlay of Black Lives Matter during this time, it is a serious convergence of huge complexity for the world to navigate. And now we also, have winter and people are worrying about surges and becoming ill. And this is the reality. There is a lot going on and a lot for people to deal with. And Andrew's talked about, how people are feeling about going back to work, and that despite all the protocols and the safety measures, there are huge amounts of anxiety around what if I catch the virus at work. There's also grief. I mean, people have died here. A lot of organizations have been completely inadequate in terms of how they've actually managed to deal with people's grief, and how they deal with this as an organization. So how are they reintegrating people back into work? How are we dealing with people feeling overwhelmed? And I think that mental and physiological wellness are equally important, and we need humanizing of our leadership in order to ensure that we are better supporting our people through all of this. We also now have the added challenge of Section 189s that are rapidly emerging. And Andrew alluded to a number that might, be happening very soon in terms of people who would have lost their jobs. How are we as leaders and as HR, the HR fraternity, and as line managers, how are we actually guiding people through this? So the topic of mental wellness has been around for a long time. I just think that what has happened is that the coronavirus pandemic has put a spotlight on mental health like never before. And there is a slew of startling statistics, which I'm not going to talk to you about it today, but it's quite clear that the research is showing that the majority of our employees are dealing with some type of mental health issue as a result of this pandemic, and particularly issues that, before this, it might have pushed them further down the curve. Many are scared of their physical health, their childcare responsibilities, their new realities. I think financial stresses are becoming a very big challenge for a lot of people now that there is, this new wave of Section 189s that are emerging. People are worried about losing their jobs and loss of money during this time. Those who've been struggling with mental health conditions before this are now even more significantly disadvantaged through COVID, and we need to understand the difficulties that people are bringing with them. And I think while some employers did not offer, too much, it is heartening to hear from Andrew that employers are beginning to understand the importance of a more full well-being, including emotional, physical, and mental support for our employees where we didn't fill that gap before. And I think we have serious flaws in our environment in terms of the mental wellness of our people. HR departments, often viewed as the heart of the organization, bogged down in administrative tasks and competing priorities, a little bit slow to catch on sometimes, but I'm going to come to that point in just a few minutes again. And then, of course, the stigmatization. I don't need to talk too much about that because that's already been mentioned, but that is a reality that many of us are facing. So the topic of mental health and wellness has become more and more top of mind for the C-suite, more and more top of mind for the boards, as we try to, find a way to induct ourselves and integrate ourselves into our new realities. I think that this mental wellness being top of mind for the C-suite and for the board is frankly long overdue. Mental health and wellness issues aren't just the right thing to do. You cannot run a business if you are not taking care of your people, and that is, it costs companies billions of rand a year for not focusing on this specific aspect. And I think by ingraining awareness, building a overall culture of care, of empathy, of openness with people where they can dialogue, where there is a safe place, of educating people, and builds an invaluable foundation for healthy workplaces that benefits everyone, where people can be productive and high performing, and their true talents can be unleashed. So I think there's a convergence of complexities: economic downgrades, the virus, the digitization, gender-based violence, living with perpetrators, Black Lives Matter, grief, alcohol, remote work, and then the physical disconnect. Human beings are social beings, and this physical disconnect is taking its toll on all of us in a whole variety of ways. And then, of course, is the fear of people who are living with current comorbidities and pre-existing mental and physiological challenges. Huge complexities. So how are we going to navigate our way through all of this as we try to reopen? How do we recover and at the same time find a way to bounce back? And human capital professions supporting business leaders, be they the board, the CEO, the C-suite, line managers, must lead. And if you're an HR professional right now, it is your job to lead your organization through this difficult time, and you need to be given the resources and the capability to do this. You're a trusted leader to our C-suite and our boards, and that there is a long list that needs to be addressed here. So I think this is personal and this is real, and we need to focus on this as seriously as we possibly can here. I think that we might have talked about this once or twice, Judy, about the fact that human capital professionals are navigating this and have to be more strategic in terms of advising the business. They are the trusted advisors to the CEO and to the board. HR needs to be in the lead and cannot, with respect, be reporting to the finance department and not be serving on an executive committee. I think the time for HR professionals now has come to play a lead to making sure that we put the lives as well as the livelihoods of our people first. And often when HR reports come to boards, people lean back and wait for it to be done. This needs to change if we're going to be serious about our people. Now, the world of work has changed, and I'm not going to go into too much detail there because we touched on digital space planning, repurposing, and reskilling. We also need to think about all the restructuring and retrenchment going on in the psychology of all of this, and the protection of our people, especially those who are vulnerable. So I wanted to close and say, Judy, that it's a time to humanize our leadership if we are going to succeed and unleash the energy of our people into this new mode. Leadership must be about the greater good and demonstrate purpose at a time like this. It must have a people-first mindset and be humanistic. They must be able to be compassionate and more empathetic and build trust in order to have impact. There must be more active listening, and this is what's wonderful about sessions like this. And they must be honest and fair and transparent in their approach to people and inspire them at this time. I also want to encourage our leaders not to be short-termist and cost-cutting in the approach to how they're going to be dealing with people and how they deal with Section 189s. We need to be far more focused on how we flatten the mental health curve as well. I will end there, Judy, and we can take further discussion in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful, Shirley and Andrew. I think you've given us so much excellent content. while people get ready for the Q&A, obviously you can use the raise your hand function. You can also just wave on the screen. We're not too pedantic. So can I take the first round of questions, please?
Do we have, sorry, it's Danny here. Do we have any questions?
Or comments, or would someone like to share their experience around what has transpired at their place of work? Shirley, do you have any examples of, you take places like retail, the mining industry, you serve on some of those boards. Would you mind sharing some concrete examples of how those board meetings have been conducted? And then Andrew, if you could add some case studies from the various services that you offer at ICAS. So I'll have a stab at the first set of questions.
Thank you, Judy. So it's very interesting because boards are responsible for oversight, for governance, for ethical leadership, and for all of the matters that will ensure that we take the best interests of the organization at heart, and we ensure that we are building businesses with long-term sustainability and capability. And a big element of the most recent discussions, especially in remuneration committees, have been on how are we going to ensure, and it's been quite pivotal actually, which has been very interesting for me. How are we going to ensure that we are going to continue to have high-performing organizations, productive people in our organizations, and at the same time show them the necessary care and empathy and compassion in order for them to bring all of themselves to work. And I'm seeing a little bit of a move from from taking employees as trusted human beings in a workplace, rather than disposable commodities and assets. And I still think there are some organizations that have a culture of human beings are disposable. The first thing we do when we hit a revenue bump or the profits start to dry up, we've got to look at the efficiencies. And there's a lot of talk about efficiency and financial sustainability. And the best place to always cut, because it is the biggest part of the spend of any organization, is to turn to people and to say, so some of you need to go. And then it's also about how those Section 189s then happen. There are processes around it, but I'm talking about, what are the values that underpin the way we actually do these sorts of things. And I think boards are demanding a little bit more attention to how we're ensuring that we are sending out the right messages, that we are communicating more effectively and more frequently with staff, that we are ensuring also that people, not just staff, you must remember there are clients, there are regulators, there are communities around your business. Some of the research is beginning to show the way you're going to be treating your people during this period is going to impact on your brand for much, much longer after all of this is said and done. And I think that, we need to listen to that, and we need to say, are we ensuring that our mindset in terms of human beings is coming sufficiently to the table now, in terms of, a lot of these things also used to be, this touchy-feely, soft stuff we don't want to hear. I remember talking in organizations, apart, who were in severe financial strain, like a Nedbank and so on, talking about care and concern and empathy, and people want to roll their eyes when, as an executive, you start to, or as a board member, you start to ask those sort of questions. And I think all of us must start asking more of those kinds of questions if we are going to find a way to move forward through this crisis.
Thank you, Shirley. Would you like to have another stab at it, Danny? And there was a specific question for you, and that is, does ICAS offer sessions to capacitate leaders in order to deal with what is happening and to support employers? So some leadership development offerings from your side.
Thank you. I think Shirley's put it particularly articulately, and I think the big challenge with leadership is really helping to move issues related to mental health from the view that C-suite often has, that they are welfare, tears and tissue type of issues, to recognizing that they make financial sense, that they are unhappy and unhealthy employees are not productive. And if you do have to deal with the inevitability of 189 in certain organizations, the issue is how you manage that from a people perspective. It sends a very powerful message, not only to those leaving the organization, but also to those who remain. And so when we deal with helping organizations that are going through large change processes that may or may not involve redundancy, it's absolutely critical that there's appropriate care and empathy shown to those individuals. There are kind of three categories. There are those who leave the organization, you're almost your corporate refugees, and how you manage that is really, really important. There are those who remain, who often are perceived by leadership to be, they should be grateful because they've kept their jobs, but often they're not. They are badly impacted by it. They're not sure if they're going to be next. They have to deal with an expanded workload. And then people who are often the most forgotten are the executioners. Nobody feels sorry for the executioner, the manager who has to tell someone that they're being retrenched when their kids go to school together and they braai together on weekends. So the approach that you take, which I think Shirley highlighted, it's not about whether you do it or not. That's a different discussion. It's how you manage people from an empathic point of view in a position of care that really makes sense to the organization. And a big part of how organizations are led at the moment is recognizing that empathy, the agility that leaders need, is not about a softness. It's about the hard, real skills that exist at the moment. I ran a session for one of the financial institutions, the board, a little while ago, and one of them was very open with me. He said, Andrew, when he grew up, the smart guys did law and accounting and actuarial science, and we went on to do well, to become the leaders. The others did HR and social science and those sorts of things. And now he had just been sent on a course overseas, and he says he comes back and they're telling him that the hard skills of today for leaders are all these soft skills. And he said, to be honest, I don't actually have those. And I think what was really good is people are recognizing that it's critical to business success at the moment. It's not just tears and tissue welfare stuff. It's critical to success. So how you manage that's important. And to answer that specific question, yes, certainly, providing support to assist leaders to develop this new skill set becomes absolutely critical going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any further questions?
Andrew, I see there's a question for you saying, is mental health a topic that's being prioritized at board level, given where we are in the country at the moment? And then also, does your organization offer sessions to capacitate leaders to deal with and support employees during this time?
So the answer to the second one is yes, we do. With some limitations, we'd need to discuss that and make sure we stay within our area of expertise. I think the first question on whether boards take it seriously or not is a difficult one, and certainly I wouldn't lump all organizations together. I think there's a great degree of variability. As Shirley said, historically, I think boards haven't. But increasingly, they are starting to realize just how important it is. And I think the whole COVID-19 crisis has put it on the table. But we've had a huge move, even pre-COVID, towards a greater awareness about the importance of mental health. If we look at it internationally, there are things like the Me Too movement, for example. There in the UK, there were the princes that came out and said, we had mental health challenges around the death of our mom, and then celebrities got hold of this and said, we all need to have some mental health challenge in our background. And I say that a little bit cynically, but I think what's been really good is that it started to uncover that mental health issue and destigmatize mental health issues a little bit more, and I think that's caused people in the workplace, particularly new generation, Generation Z that aren't so concerned about those kinds of the stigma associated with that, to come out and say, these are part of my challenges that I need help with. And there are more progressive organizations that I think are starting to recognize that. The real challenge will be when when people feel that it's some sort of a trade-off between fixing the balance sheet and looking after, being caring. I think as Shirley pointed out, it's not an either or, that the one goes hand in hand with the other. And I think boards have got some way to most organizations to really learn and accept that, and to develop empathy. A lot of executive development at the moment often looks at developing those kinds of skills that historically they weren't valued at C-suite level.
Thank you, Shirley. And there's a question around the difficult conversations that are not happening in the workplace at the moment, in lieu of or post the Black Lives Matter movement and the issue of racism in South Africa. And then, of course, the current wave of gender-based violence matters that are again plaguing the psyche of South Africans. And so you're dealing with multiple pandemics here: racism, GBVF, and of course, how are you going to balance even raising these issues in the workplace when the severity of the bottom line is the reality facing many leaders? And then my comment or observation, Andrew, to use that word executioner, it's a very loaded word. And it actually gives me goosebumps when I hear that, because people are asking for the return of the death penalty. So just a comment on why you chose to use a word like that.
Well, perhaps just to start like that, I think that's how people that have to implement the decisions. A board would make a decision normally that we need to, there needs to be a change management process that involves redundancy. And the people that then have to execute that decision are often, your middle management. And the people that then lose their jobs see those individuals as the executioner. And nobody feels sorry for them. They're the ones who's sitting me down and telling me I have no job. But the reason I use such a loaded word is because they themselves often suffer enormously when it comes to that. They don't necessarily agree with the decision, or they have to implement something that they find particularly difficult at a personal level. So they're put into the position of executor. The executioner, they're treated as such by by individuals who are losing their jobs, and their mental health, their welfare is often ignored in that whole process. So it's really important that care is also given to those individuals. So I use the word deliberately.
I'm not averse to it. I do feel people, you talk to people today who years ago retrenched people, and the scars are still there. They end up going into therapy, etc. So may I ask you, Shirley, for your response, and then a closing comment, and a closing comment from you, Andrew, and then I'll close.
Thank you very much, Julia. I think that one of the, or two or three of these huge societal challenges that has, been so part of who we are even before this, has emerged as stark and brutal gender-based violence, femicide that we've ever seen, especially in South Africa, to the point that our president had to make a very bold statement in his last announcement and read the names of the people. I thought that was pretty courageous, because these people have names, they have families, they live in communities. And I think that every single board, every chair, every CEO must begin to put in place strategies that says, this is not an HR issue. This is a business issue. This is a societal issue. And we cannot take a kind of tick box effort, to try and resolve these problems. the problems of Black Lives Matters. It's George Floyd's name is all over the world, and it has reignited the flames that have been there always, because we've never properly attended to matters of racism. We've never really drilled down into, you know, how are we going to take people through a healing journey, and how are we going to deal with people who continue to perpetuate either gender-based violence or prejudice or discrimination that leads to Black Lives Matter protests and people still having to die. I think that we need to go back to our values. We have to reestablish who we are, what we stand for, what we are all about. We've got to treat people with integrity, dignity, and respect. And we as board members, Judy, have a fiduciary duty of care and diligence to our people. And this is something that we don't talk about too much. And I think there needs to be education for board members, there needs to be education for leadership, for line managers, for HR, that says, these are the things that are now going to be the priority. I think it's been peripheral for us. It's been sort of there, but it now has become fundamental that we've got to deal with it. And I think just in my closing comment, Judy, I think that, you know, we need to open the door for new corporate cultures that are inclusive around being able to have open and authentic conversations that create safe places for people to be truly who they are. And I think leadership needs to embrace that. And I want to say in the issue of mental wellness, companies must now prioritize mental health and wellness issues in the workplace. It's the right thing to do, and we must do more. We cannot stand by and have Black Lives Matter, gender-based violence, mental illnesses in the workplace any longer. The urgency has never been greater. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you very much for those closing comments, Shirley. Andrew?
Sorry, just very quickly, I think what's absolutely critical in any workplace is for people to understand that these issues will only be addressed if we can have those courageous conversations. People will only come forward if they feel safe to do so, if they feel they have a sense of belonging and that they're able to speak up. So it's one thing to have policies in place, to have diversity and inclusion committees. What organizations need to do, I absolutely agree with Shirley, this is not an HR issue, it's an organizational issue, is to assist people to feel that they belong, to have the courage and facilitate the courageous conversations about race, about gender, about everything, and to recognize that they are corporate citizens, they're part of a broader society, and these are not things that sit outside the workplace, they're integral to our operation in the workplace. Unless we're able to have discussions about all forms of diversity, be that race, be that gender, be that mental health status or disability status, it's creating a culture and environment that facilitates those conversations, not just having a policy or piece of paper saying that we address it or making a statement about it. So you'll have people like Sim Shabalala at Standard Bank who will write an open letter or make a statement about it, and that's incredibly powerful, sends an incredibly powerful message, not only to his own employees, but to the organization as a whole. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you so much. So to all of you who have joined us today, and especially to Sandra and Danny and Yamkela, who arranged it, I honor you and I name you. And I'd like to conclude and leave you with a few ideas, or maybe new ideas, or maybe not so new, and this idea of ambiguous loss. Because at the moment, we don't really know what, we have a sense of loss. We have lost so many intangible elements of our normal lives that we can hardly identify what we are missing. The loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll, the loss of connection. And this is a collective grief that's in the air, anticipatory grief, because we are also anticipating and not too sure on what is going to come next. So I think we deal with these issues around the anticipation, the ambiguity, and the uncertainty. So what is left for me to say is that I conclude by thanking you for joining with us today, for making the time. And I leave you with a question, and that is, who copes well in crisis? Because as you may all be aware of it, the new mantra that everybody's on about is, don't put a good crisis to waste, or don't let a good crisis to waste. And the reality is we use words that are so loaded because who copes well in a crisis? Not many of us. So once again, thank you for spending your time with us today. And we do hope that this has been somewhat helpful. Goodbye.
Thank you, Judy. Can I just hop in for 1 second before you all log off? Sure. I'd like to, on behalf of Business for South Africa, thank Judy, and as well as our other speakers. But I would also just like to say that I've got all of your email addresses, and we will send you a copy of the recording and a link to the guidelines once we've downloaded afterwards. So thank you very much to all of you for making the time today.
Thank you. Be well.